Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to advance the eco-socialist policies that Angela Walker and I ran on in 2020. So what's on everybody's mind today is this war in Ukraine. And I think first thing we have to do is denounce the aggressive war by Russia against Ukraine. U.S. NATO imperialism is the worst imperialism in the world, but it's no excuse for Russian imperialism. And I think, if Putin thinks that his aggression would divide NATO, I think he's already lost because NATO is reunified under U.S. leadership. We can expect NATO military budgets to increase now. More U.S. NATO troops, missiles, and aircraft are going to be deployed to the eastern border of NATO, the western border of Russia. Putin might have counted on China to back him, but Xi called for President Xi called for negotiations yesterday, and at the UN Security Council they abstained from the resolution calling for Russia to withdraw from Ukraine, which Russia vetoed, but China did not veto as well. And, there are other things, Kazakhstan, in which Russia had recently intervened to put down a rebellion, particularly by oil workers, has refused to send troops to join the Russians in the Ukraine. I mean, it's hard to find any allies that Russia has in this. It's aside from Belarus, which Russian troops occupy, and the dictator there is in power thanks to Russia, and Assad in Syria. I can't find anybody else who's spoken out in favor. U.S. NATO imperialism has been a problem. We promised, James Baker, the Secretary of State at the time, promised the president of the Soviet Union, or maybe as the prime minister, in any case, Gorbachev, as well as the foreign minister, Shevardnadze, that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward. That's the quote. We won't move 1 inch eastward. Won't move NATO 1 inch eastward. And then under the Clinton and Bush administrations, NATO expanded eastward right up to Russia's border. Putin has said a lot of crazy things this week. He gave a speech just before the invasion, which was a revanchist, great Russian chauvinism that makes you think his motivation was more about trying to rebuild the old Russian Empire than his concerns about NATO on his border. He denied that there's such a thing as a Ukrainian national identity, and it has a right to statehood. He went on this anti-communist screed about how it's only because of Lenin and the Bolsheviks and their policy of national self-determination that Ukraine even exists. He's talking about denazification of Ukraine, which is kind of crazy. I mean, the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, is a Jew. The prime minister, before Zelensky was elected, was a Jew. The far-right parties that are, you could say, are neo-Nazis, Swoboda and the right sector, have no representatives in a 450-member parliament, which has proportional representation and a 5% threshold to enter. There was a far-right coalition of Swoboda, right sector, and some other neo-Nazi type parties. And they only got 2.5% in the parliamentary elections, which means they got no representation. And their presidential candidate only got 1.6% in that presidential election in 2019, which shows, yes, there is a small, far-right neo-Nazi organizations in Ukraine, but they're in the U.S., they're in Russia. They seem to have no influence in the Ukrainian government. And, the right did have representation in their parliament. They had 12 members of Swoboda after the 2012 election, and after the 2014 election, after the Maidan resolution, they got 6 from Swoboda and 1 from the right sector. And they lost all those seats, which were tiny to begin with, in the 2019 elections. And this is really a dangerous situation. NATO countries are going to be providing arms to the Ukrainian resistance, including Stinger missiles that can take out tanks and manpads that can do ground-to-air strikes against helicopters and other low-flying aircraft. And Putin threatened that, any country that does something like that, he threatened them with nukes this week, which is scary and I think should be taken seriously. In fact, Putin claimed that Ukraine is developing nuclear weapons, and that's one reason why he's invading, to demilitarize them. That is as far out as the US claiming that Iraq was developing nuclear weapons to justify the US invasion of Iraq. So we're in a situation where the leader of Russia seems to have become unhinged. He's not acting on rational geopolitical grounds, but more on an ideological Russian chauvinism and, just transparently false accusations, like the Ukrainian government is a Nazi government. And we have a problem here where I think our peace movement, parts of it, are very confused and have really become apologists for Russian imperialism. I listened to a webinar on Tuesday night, sponsored by the United Anti-War Coalition. And this is a couple of days before the invasion started. And not one speaker said a word in defense of Ukraine's right to self-determination. Some of them said the Ukraine crisis was solely the fault of US and NATO. Now, no doubt US and NATO, by expanding NATO right up to the doorstep of Russia and by intervening in the Ukraine in the 2014 revolution and coup, and the reports are they've discouraged Ukraine from following up on their end of the Minsk agreements, which were agreed to in 2015 by Russia, Ukraine. The UN Security Council endorsed that. That would have provided for a ceasefire, withdrawal of Russian troops, recognition of the Eastern Russian-speaking provinces in the Donbass, some kind of autonomy. And now some of these peace groups, they say rather than, Russia out of Ukraine, they say no war with Russia. And what are they saying? Ukraine shouldn't defend itself? That it's, NATO that's fighting Russia? We are indirectly. It's definitely a proxy war. But they're speaking as if the crimes of US imperialism justify Russian imperialism. And this is a bad look for the peace movement. I mean, people are acting like cold warriors. They're just taking the Russian side instead of the US side. And what we really need to do is independent of both sides and oppose imperialism from all directions. These pro-Russian statements are going to alienate rather than mobilizing people for the US peace movement. I mean, that rhetoric of supporting, Russian aggression has no appeal to the US public except the pro-Putin far right, the Tucker Carlsons and the Steve Bannons and the Eric Princes and the David Dukes, and the rest of the far right who have loved Putin for years because of his anti-gay homophobia, his anti-feminism, his anti-socialism, his pro-fossil fuels, climate change denialism, and what they really like is the white Christian nationalism. Now, the white may be projected onto Russia because it's a white country, but it's definitely that Christian nationalism and social conservatism that they like, not to speak of the authoritarianism. So that's who these pro-imperialist, Russian imperialist, so-called anti-imperialists are getting in bed with. And I think it's a sure way to kneecap the US peace movement, which wants to demand, military spending cuts, ending foreign wars, and pushing for nuclear disarmament. But it's not going to attract people if it's supporting Putin's aggressive war in the Ukraine. And I think, what we have to recognize is that the world has changed. A lot of people that may be taking this position are still reacting to the unipolar world where the US was the sole superpower and leader of world imperialism. And that's no longer the case. We now have a multipolar world and there are inter-imperialist rivalries and conflicts between various capitalist powers. Now, the US is definitely the biggest and most powerful imperialist power, but Russia, China, Turkey, Iran, Israel are engaged in imperialist uh, activities and aggression. And so it's not only the US, and we should not take sides between these imperialists. We should oppose all of them. Um, and I think we also have to recognize that while there's rivalry between these imperialists, there's also kind of an antagonistic cooperation. They're frenemies. When Russia intervened militarily in Kazakhstan to shut down the strikes and protests by workers in the oil and gas fields, they were defending Chevron and ExxonMobil, who have gas fields in oil fields in Kazakhstan. While they're opposed to each other and what's going on in the Ukraine, all reports are that U.S. and Russian diplomats are still trying to close the Iran nuclear deal, which let's hope doesn't become a casualty of this conflict, because it's needed to, stop nuclear proliferation to Iran, and Iran wants it. They want to get their sanctions lifted. So while they're fighting, they're also cooperating. We had the Wagner Mercenaries, which are basically Russia's what was the Eric Prince's group called? Blackwater. It's the equivalent of what Blackwater was. All reports are it's close to the Russian military. They've got mercenaries in many African countries. They were in Mozambique defending ExxonMobil oil fields, and the U.S. didn't oppose that. And then in Syria, you've had long, Russian-U.S. deconfliction and cooperation in the air war against ISIS in eastern Syria, and against ISIS and other fundamentalist Islamist groups now in Idlib in northwestern Syria. For example, when the U.S. took out that ISIS leader earlier this month in Idlib, they had to get Russian permission and okay, because Russia controls that airspace. So another example is Russia and the U.S. gave Turkey the okay to invade the northeastern borderlands of Syria to push back the Kurds, who the Turks are fighting in their own country and actually bombing in Iraq right now. And then you've got the cooperation of Russia and Israel regarding Israeli bombing of Iranian targets in Syria. And in Libya, which is a total mess, you've got two sides. You got Turkey, Qatar, Iran, the UK, and Italy supporting the government in Tripoli. And on the other side is Russia, Egypt, the UAE, France, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Syria, and the U.S., at least under Trump, supporting General Haftar, who's a former general from Gaddafi. So this is another oil war actually in Ukraine. Ukraine wants Russian oil going through pipelines across Ukraine to Europe because they make a lot of money on the transit fees. Russia wants to sell its oil to Europe. They want the Nord Stream 2 pipeline to increase the capacity to sell oil to Europe and not have to deal with Ukraine. Europe wants the oil, and the U.S. would like to see the oil from Russia curtailed so they can sell more of our fracked oil and gas to Europe. So this is another oil war, which makes our policy for a Green New Deal an anti-war policy, because to the extent we can reduce the world's dependence on fossil fuels, the wars over oil become less relevant. So, what should our policy be? I think we have to impose all imperialism and to be in solidarity with the people fighting for peace and democracy in their own countries. And that doesn't mean we take sides between the imperialist powers, the states. We stand with the people and their movements. So, the enemy of my enemy is not necessarily my friend. That policy gets you some god-awful allies, authoritarian capitalists and imperialist states. So we don't have to choose sides between imperialist powers, big or small. We should oppose all imperialism, which I think the immediate demands we need to be raising right now: Russia out of the Ukraine. The US NATO should change their policy in support of militarily non-aligned Ukraine, so that, even if it wasn't Putin in office, anybody in office in Russia would be concerned that NATO had encircled them, at least from the east and the southern side. The east, it's already there. If it got into Ukraine, it would be from the south. And we need to open up negotiations about a security architecture that includes Russia and Western Europe and the states in between. That was on the table when the U.S. promised Russia, after the Berlin Wall fell, Germany was reunited, and soon the Soviet Union fell apart. That's what was under discussion. And instead, U.S. and NATO pushed eastward. They felt like we're the sole superpower. We can take what we want. And that is one of the, underlying causes of the situation we're in. And then as to how to resolve this between the Ukraine and Russia, I think we should be demanding that they return to the Normandy format where the Minsk agreement was forged. That included Germany, France, the Ukraine, and Russia, and provided for, as I said earlier, withdrawal of Russian forces from the Ukraine, Ukraine giving some autonomy to the Russian-speaking regions in the east of Ukraine, and that still seems to me that the basis for a resolution. And I think we also have to recognize that this war creates a very difficult political situation for us. Foreign policy crises tend to drive domestic policy off the agenda and weaken reform movements. I mean, just look back in our own history. World War II was the end of the progressive movement and greatly weakened the socialist movement. World War II ended the New Deal. Vietnam War ended the Great Society. We lost the war against poverty in Vietnam, in the Vietnam War. So there's going to be a lot of push to increase the military budget, and our demands for social and environmental protections are going to be harder to raise. As I mentioned, the Iran nuclear deal may be a casualty. The issues we've been debating all year, the voting rights and honest elections bills are dead. The climate action bill is dead. It's all going to be about militarism. So, what do we do as Greens now? I think we have to keep raising our program in the streets and in elections, even though the larger political context is more difficult as a result of this war. But we have to remember that the majority of people are with us and not with the Democrats and Republicans on the Green New Deal, Medicare for all, taxing the rich to pay for these things. And so we need to organize and mobilize that majority. And I think within the anti-war movement, the Greens can play an important role by saying we should be against all imperialist wars. We don't take sides between imperialists. And we should put forward positive pro-peace policies. Domestic budgets, less spending on the military, and a foreign policy that promotes nuclear and general disarmament. We need demilitarization and collective security. So we have a lot to say about this. And in this current crisis, I think what we have to say is more relevant than ever. So those are my thoughts. I'll be interested in hearing yours and your questions. Jean Los Pascalides. Ukraine does have Nazis in the government since the coup in 2014. They have been bombing Russian-speaking people. Well, where are these Nazis? There is the Azov battalion. It's been integrated into the Russian military. They're based along that contact line between the separatist areas and Ukraine. Now, the Nazis, the Ukraine military, there have been exchanges of mortar and gunfire along trenches, almost like World War I, for 8 years now. But that doesn't make Ukraine a Nazi government and doesn't justify an aggressive war against Ukraine by Russia. Dolores Pierce. The U.S. has tried to block Nord Stream 2 before by imposing sanctions on companies involved in the project. However, it has only targeted Russian firms and not German ones for fear of damaging diplomatic relations with Berlin. Russia is keen to boost supplies of gas to Europe from its vast fields in the west of the country. It wants an undersea pipeline to Europe rather than relying on land-based pipelines, which go through Poland and Ukraine. These pipeline networks are aging and inefficient. I guess there's more coming. Well, I mentioned that before that, the U.S. would like to have a bigger share of the Western market for oil and gas versus Russia. Um, that doesn't justify, uh, the U.S. Opposing Nord Stream 2 on those grounds. Um, but it doesn't justify, the Russians going into Ukraine to stop the oil from going through Ukraine and having it go through Nord Stream 2. Now, Nord Stream 1 is already built and it's operating. Um, so I'm not sure what the point is. We need to get off oil and gas so we aren't fighting wars over it, among other reasons. We got to, protect the climate, obviously. Gene Lowe's Pascalides. Should Crimea be able to cede and be part of Russia if they vote for that? Yeah, in general, the principle of self-determination should be respected. When you have a snap referendum after the country's occupied by Russian military, that brings into question the legitimacy. And, no one in the world, all right, there may be one or two countries, but not even China recognizes that Crimea is part of Russia. Um, that's something that's really important to the Chinese, that there not be intervention in the changing of borders of other countries. So, I support that in principle, but, that's very repressive now toward, for example, the indigenous Tartars. Um, so I guess what I think about that. I don't think demanding that Crimea be brought back into Ukraine, we should go to war over that. What are your thoughts on Biden's speech? Well, which one? He's made a lot. Are you referring to the State of the Union speech, which he's about to give? I'm not sure. I think the problem with the policy of the Biden administration on this is that they have not said that Ukraine can be militarily neutral and independent. They've insisted on keeping the option of them joining NATO on the table, even though NATO doesn't want them because the country's too corrupt, for one thing, and to defend it militarily uh, would be very difficult. I mean, there's no way if the U.S. intervened militarily with conventional forces, uh, they can beat the Russians, who have, they're much closer. They have the supply lines. Their forces are already there. Uh, it would take a long mobilization like we did for the Gulf Wars before we could even hope to contest them militarily. And we don't want to do that because a U.S.-Russia war would trigger nuclear war, and that's the end of all of us. And you want me to respond to his last speech? I mean, he's out there almost every day. I'm not sure. Maybe you could say, any particular parts of it that I should respond to, because he's, I know the general policy, which I just commented on. Talk about West Ukraine. Why did they look at East Ukraine, with antagonism? I'm not sure that's the case. The Russian speakers, I think, are about 1/3 of the country. Almost everybody speaks Ukrainian and Russian. The families are intermarried. I think the ethnic division has been overplayed, particularly by Russia. There are claims that the Ukrainian-speaking population wants to exterminate the Russian-speaking population. There's no evidence for that. There is conflict between the separatists and Ukraine in the east, but there's nothing to say that they're trying to wipe out Russian speakers, because so many Ukrainians, including President Zelensky, he comes from a Russian-speaking family. So I think that's been over-exaggerated, particularly by the Russian side. Gloria Thomas, I do think most people agree with green policies, but every time I talk to anybody, everyone just immediately dismisses voting third party. I think the Green Party needs to focus on local actions. I agree, including local election campaigns, where in a lot of states, so they're nonpartisan, but even where they're partisan, it's often the case that it's a Green versus the incumbent who represents the major party in that district. So, we're not being spoilers. And we can win those elections. We have over 100 elected officials. We should be focusing on local elections so we can increase that into the thousands and lay the political foundation for then running effective campaigns for state legislatures and the House of Representatives. Now, to get rid of the problem of the spoiler effect in third parties, we've really got to push ranked choice voting and proportional representation. If I learned anything from running for president, until we have that, we're up against an electoral system that is exclusive. It excludes everybody but the winner. It's winner take all. And when it's based on single member districts for legislative bodies, not only do third parties like the Green Party get excluded, so do the supporters of a major party that happens to be the minor party in that district. Most districts under single member district, winner take all elections, are one party districts. They're one party states. And, why even bother voting when you know who the winner is going to be? That's the system we got to change. We change that, it opens up the political process, and the Greens will get their fair share of representation. And I think people will be surprised at how much support we actually have. And it would just change the politics of this country. So I think that's got to be a top line issue for us, along with the Green New Deal and an economic Bill of Rights and peace policies. Scout Trooper 164, what do you think of the mainstream media branding skeptics of Ukraine conflict as traitors? So I guess you're saying people who skeptics would be people who question U.S. NATO's contribution to creating this situation. That's not constructive, to say the least. The mainstream media should have people who are critical of U.S. NATO policy in expanding NATO, in recognizing that NATO has not been a defensive organization, but an aggressive formation, bombing Serbia, breaking up Yugoslavia, intervening in Iraq and Afghanistan, Libya. Those were wars of aggression, and not defending. NATO was set up to defend against expansion of the Soviet Union, which I think was unlikely. I'm more scared of Putin than I ever was of, Brezhnev and Khrushchev and people like that. They wanted peaceful coexistence. They were just trying to consolidate the areas they controlled. They did have Eastern European countries as satellites. They didn't want them to liberalize, so they intervened in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968. But it was not because they wanted to go after Germany and France and Austria and the other Western European countries. I think the danger now is Putin wants to recover the old Russian Empire. He's not trying to rebuild the Soviet Union. He's trying to rebuild the Russian Empire of the czars. And you can see that in his speeches, particularly with regard to Ukraine. He had a 7,000 word long essay. You can read it on the Kremlin website, last July that denied the Ukrainians national identity and their right to statehood. And then a couple of days before Russia invaded this week, he gave that speech. I guess it was the morning they invaded, where he said that it's all the fault of Lenin and the Bolsheviks for recognizing the right of nations to self-determination. So, there needs to, obviously in the mainstream media, there needs to be more perspectives, including those critical of NATO's policies over the years. So I think, the mainstream media is basically corporate state media instead of directly state media. And of course, the corporations control the government, so their line is put out there. So you never hear discussion of how, or rarely, that part of the reason for this war is that U.S. oil companies and gas companies want a bigger share of the European market. And one thing this war does, and cutting off Nord Stream 2 does, is require Europe to look for other sources for oil and gas, which the U.S. is the biggest producer in the world. Saudi Arabia is next, and Russia's third. So, the oil companies are, licking their chops at the profits to be made out of this. That's kind of perspective that needs to be in the mainstream media, should be. Won't be, so we're going to have to, raise it ourselves, build our own media. Howie, do you think Putin's NATO concerns are legit? Yeah, as I said, they are. And any leader of Russia, even if it was a democratic socialist Russia, would be concerned that NATO was putting its military right up against the border of Russia. They put anti-ballistic missile facilities in Poland and Romania, which can be easily converted to offensive nuclear weapons, which are so close to Russia that any missile fired at Russia, they'd immediately have to respond nuclearly because there's not time to really assess what happens. So that's very dangerous. So yes, the NATO concerns are legit. What I'm concerned about with Putin is that he spent more time the last week justifying going into Ukraine on the grounds that Ukrainians are sort of lost Russians. They're not really a separate nationality. And, that's old great Russian chauvinism that we've had since the czars. Mr. Anderson, do you think sanction on Russia will further hurt the people of Venezuela or Cuba? Yeah, they could, to the extent Russia's providing aid to Venezuela and Cuba. It's not much aid, it's some. Greg Palast had an interesting column this week. He said, you want to undermine Russian oil and gas, lift the sanctions on Venezuela, which has lots of oil and gas to sell, which shows how contradictory U.S. policy is in some respects. Violeted Content Boutique. What commodities does Russia have to offer besides oil and wheat? Arms. They have a sophisticated arms industry, and it's a large, not as big as the U.S. for sure, but they do sell a lot of arms around the world. So that's the third big commodity that they sell. Jim J.T. Remulus. Howie, thank you for insight on the Ukrainian situation. So many lefties are rooting for the Russians. I support your idea that we against all imperialism, including Russian. Yeah, I think that's the classic policy of the left, socialist internationalism. We're not with capitalist states, we're with the people fighting for peace and democracy. And that's a position that I think we can mobilize Americans around, not whether we're on one side or the other of this Cold War or with one imperialist state against another. Scout Trooper 164, what do you think of gas skyrocketing while oil flatlines. I haven't thought much about it. I do know that the frackers are withholding gas in order to get higher prices. And oil flatlining, I think that may be temporary. I did pay a little attention to the price of oil, and it's a little over $100. And some people are speculating it could go up to 150, like it did in the middle of the Great Recession at the peak of it, or even higher. And that will, adversely affect economies all over the world. Which is just another argument. If Germany wants to get off Russian gas, they should have a crash program to retrofit all their buildings with heat pumps so they don't have to heat and cook with gas. Same thing we should be doing that here in the United States. For climate reasons, aside from the, price of gas and oil. Fred Gunter, NE, I'm not sure what that stands for. A U.S. commander with 10 tours of Afghanistan says we will be pulled in this war if it continues much longer. Do you agree? I'm afraid we might. I think what the U.S. and NATO are going to do is provide arms. As I mentioned, the anti-tank Stingers, the man-pads against low-flying aircraft, as well as light arms and ammunition. And Russia could respond. I mean, Putin even said with nuclear arms, tactical nuclear weapons, maybe. It's a very dangerous situation. So could we be pulled in? I do agree we could be. And in a way, we're already in it because we're providing these arms. So we're doing as proxies. During the Cold War, we had many conflicts like this. Vietnam, we invaded Vietnam, and the Russians provided much smaller scale support for the North Vietnamese army. And that went on for years, but it didn't lead to a wider conflict. Although I remember being worried about that at the time, particularly when, spring of 1972, Nixon and Kissinger mined Haiphong Harbor and started running bombing runs right up against the Chinese border. And, there was fears that the Chinese might then get involved, although they and the Vietnamese have a long thousands of year history of antagonism. So that was probably not what was going to happen. But yeah, any of these wars, even if they're proxy wars without direct involvement of either side, can blow up. And that's the thing. When you get into a war, it doesn't go according to plan. As some reports out of, the military reports out of Ukraine are saying right now, that Putin, may have got himself into another Afghanistan and faces years of insurgency. If not, there's even some speculation that the Russian generals are not happy and may move against Putin. That's speculation. I don't know. But once a war starts, really anything can happen. That's why we got to, demand peace and end the conflict, withdraw the Russian troops. Let's recognize Ukraine as a militarily neutral country and recognize its independence. And then, go back to that Normandy format and, try to negotiate a solution for the concerns of the Russian speakers. They do have legitimate concerns. That first government after the 2014 revolution or coup, whatever you want to call it, did restrict the use of Russian as an official language in parts of Ukraine where it really was, because it was majority Russian speakers. And, those kind of things need to be negotiated. I know the Ukrainians were concerned that you give autonomy to the Donbass provinces and it would effectively give them a political veto over policy in the central government. But I think that can be negotiated. So, they have their proportional share of power, but not a veto power, so that, the Ukrainians as a whole can make majority decisions. But that's the kind of thing they should be negotiating, not going to war over. Scout Trooper 164, honestly, with the Ukraine invasion going on, do you think the military-industrial complex will have enough ammunition to find an excuse to wage another war? Asking because their greed is sadistic. Well, they are fighting. They're fighting about a dozen wars, so-called low-intensity conflicts around the world with U.S. troops. AFRICOM is engaged in a bunch. We're still in Iraq. We're still in Syria. We just bombed Somalia again while this war in Ukraine is going on. The war in Yemen, which is basically us supporting Saudi Arabia, even though Biden said we would stop that. We have not. So the military-industrial complex. So the military is engaged, and the industrial side, yeah, there's more arms to sell, and they have the capacity to, sell as much ammunition as people fighting wars want to use. So I don't think it's an excuse to wage another war. They're already doing it, and Ukraine is, providing. It's not that big in the larger scheme of things what the U.S. might provide to the Ukrainian resistance in terms of arms. So I think they're talking right now $300 million in arms and $300 million in humanitarian aid that might pass Congress this week. That's a drop in the bucket when you have a Pentagon budget of $778 billion in the next fiscal year, and when you add in military-related spending in other departments like the Department of Energy, which runs the nuclear weapons program, the State Department, the intelligence community, and then paying for past wars, veterans benefits, the VA, it's about $1.2 trillion a year. So there's plenty of money to send, more ammunition for these wars, which doesn't mean we should, but the capacity is certainly there. Eric Gray, how should we overcome propaganda against socialism in order to get an eco-socialist Green New Deal passed nationally and internationally? Well, I think we need to make our own arguments for socialism as an expansion of democracy into the economy, among other arguments we can make. The eco-socialist Green New Deal is the only way to really get a climate policy that can actually make the rapid transition. And I think we got to fight for it. It's not going to pass nationally with this Congress and president. We got to start fighting for it at the state and local level. And, for example, New York, a large state, if it adopted that policy, it could show the way nationally and internationally. And then, when we negotiate with Russia and urge them to, stop wars for oil, as we stop doing it, we should provide technical and even economic assistance so they can switch to renewable energy sources. Russia has vast wind power resources, and they can run their economy largely on wind power. They don't need oil and gas. I mean, for them, oil and gas is not only powering their own economy, it's a commodity, their biggest commodity they sell abroad. So we've got to, do it where we can, and then use as an example to other parts. And we got to provide climate assistance, climate reparations to countries all over the world. And so how we overcome it, I think we make our case to our own people, get it passed locally, say, here's an example, and then, offer the aid to other countries that want to make that transition. Gloria Thomas, how much of the Green Party is focused on dismantling capitalism versus reducing the harms of capitalism or transitioning? So there's sort of three options there. I think, in a way, the Green New Deal is a transition program out of capitalism into a democratic socialism. It doesn't require that you socialize the whole economy immediately in order to implement, but it does socialize sections of the economy and demonstrates how socialism can work. Within the Green Party, right now, I think the majority is eco-socialist. It's passed that, put that in the national platform. More and more, green leaders in the national level are speaking of eco-socialism. But there are elements of the party that are opposed to that and are more, liberal reform and capitalism. So that debate goes on as it does in the broader left. But I think the majority Green Party now is definitely eco-socialist from every indication we have, including the fact that Angela Walker and I got nominated running on an eco-socialist platform. Frankie Lee, Howie, how can we take advantage of Nick Brana's mistakes? That's the Movement for People's Party, and get more people from the People's Party to join the Green Party. Well, I think you just talk to those activists and ask them if what they're doing is really working, and whether they can work with you in the Green Party. And we need to be having specific issue campaigns and election campaigns, because that's why most people join either one of these groups. They want to take action. They also want to learn more about the issues and see this organization as a resource. That's what we need to be offering people and giving them a place to be active. So I think that's how we take advantage. Not so much take advantage of Nick Brana's mistakes, but build the Green Party as a viable political alternative. Because Move for People's Party is not the only group on the left making mistakes, including the Green Party. But we just need to, learn from our mistakes and do better. Gloria Thomas, I would also like to talk about renewable energy. There doesn't seem to be much talk about making sure the production of green energy is ethical and doesn't depend on extraction. For instance, in Minnesota, the mining company is trying to sell itself, is trying itself to green energy to expand its mines for steel for windmills. Yeah, there's a big problem with extractivism in relation to mining for particularly rare earth minerals, but also other minerals that are needed for renewable technology like windmills and solar panels. And there are a number of things we can say about that. I'm not sure I think I got the figures in my head. There was a recent study that David Roberts, who's an energy writer, pointed out that under a fossil fuel economy, we have, 17 tons of solid waste per person per year. And if we had 100% renewables, that would be reduced to like 150 pounds a year, something like that. I mean, it was astounding. So first thing we have to understand is there'll be less extraction in a renewable economy than in a fossil fuel-based economy. But that still doesn't answer the question of how do we extract these minerals in a way that is not destroying the environment. And you can mine in a more dirty way or in a cleaner way, and you can treat the miners and the other people involved in that industry in a way that gives them living wages and health and safety standards, or not. So we need to make the mining industry as safe and as worker friendly as possible. And then we also need, as we build out this renewable energy economy, to rebuild manufacturing so it is zero waste, which means manufacturers take possession of products when they're used up and recycle those materials into a new round of products, so that a lot of the minerals, we have to mine less minerals than we can recycle the minerals already in the economy. We can get minerals out of waste dumps that have all kinds of these rare earth and other minerals sitting in landfills. So, and they're more concentrated than the random spot on the planet because uh, a lot of those products use those minerals. So, it's something that we've got to make part of the Green New Deal. And in the Green New Deal budget that we outlined in my campaign, we had a whole section on zero waste manufacturing and recycling, because that's key. And so it is a big concern. And a lot of the renewable energy advocates have not paid it much attention, although it's getting a lot more attention in the last year or two, and it should. Richard Burrow, in a Zoom webinar a couple of days ago, journalist author Vijay Prashad said that Putin has called the U.S. bluff. Vijay said we need to back off and go to the negotiation table, and all countries must back off the Cold War mentality. He also said that the worst thing there is a war. It would be a final recourse and should never be celebrated. Do you agree? I agree with everything except saying Putin called the U.S.'s bluff. I mean, what that means is the U.S., I think, was warning that Putin was amassing forces and was about to invade Ukraine. And then I guess he called the U.S.'s bluff because that's what the U.S. was saying would happen. And it happened. But that's the war that, according to this description, VJ opposes and says we should oppose all wars. So, I mean, where does that leave us? I think it leaves us as Putin should get out of Ukraine, and NATO should stop pushing itself on the Ukraine and intervening in the Ukraine. And then we need to get a situation where Ukraine is militarily neutral and it has some kind of domestic dispensation that takes account of ethnic minorities, the Russian speaking ethnic minority. That's what should be negotiated. Yeah, the worst thing is a war. Final recourse should never be celebrated. Yeah. So, I've heard this. Putin called the U.S.'s bluff before. And, it sounds like they're saying the U.S. was bluffing that Russia was going to invade. And then Russia did to call the U.S.'s bluff. I mean, so what? They invaded. They started a war. And we should oppose it. Scout Trooper 164. What do you have to say to the IRS wanting to collect facial data? I saw the headline. I haven't read the stories. I don't know what they want. I guess it's from. I'm concerned when the government is collecting facial data and other personal data about people because it can be used for repressive purposes. We certainly see that in China, and with U.S. contractors providing a lot of their technology for that. So another case of frenemies, I guess. No, I that concerns me. Violeted Content Boutique. It just seems that America and the Western world has a bad habit of ignoring the demands of dangerous leaders. Both bin Laden and Putin voiced concerns for years and decades. I mean, bin Laden targeted the U.S. because we were intervening in the Middle East, particularly having troops based in Saudi Arabia, which he considered the holy land of Islam. And Putin, as I've said, even if it wasn't Putin, whoever was head of Germany would have legitimate concerns about NATO expansion. On the other hand, you have to recognize that bin Laden and Putin are political reactionaries. Nothing progressive about their policies. So, but that doesn't mean, in terms of international relations, you don't take account of the concerns they articulate, because they do speak, as I said, with Putin, and same with bin Laden. He was speaking for a lot of people in the Middle East that didn't want the U.S. military all over it. So sometimes we got to listen to the message and ignore the messenger. And if the message makes sense, then take it into account. Amy L. Sachs. Little sympathy in the press for countries like Somalia or Syria versus Ukraine. It's definitely true. And we've been at war, are at war, as I said, in a dozen places. Not to mention U.S. Special Operations conducting operations in over 100 countries every year. And that gets no coverage. It's and when it does come to looking at those countries, uh, they don't account for the U.S. role in the mayhem and destruction that's going on in those countries. That's true. Scout Trooper 164, why do we still hold the Cold War mentality despite the war being over for 30 years? Well, I think it stems from the U.S. in the immediate post-Soviet period, considering itself the sole superpower, having what they call full spectrum dominance. In other words, air, land, sea, and space militarily. And, we're trying to hold on to that top spot. So when Russia gets stronger militarily or China grows economically, we see that as a threat to our domination. And that's why we get this Cold War mentality. We try to put those countries down rather than uh, engage with them as, equal in terms of their sovereignty and their statehood, and, work with them on the issues of mutual concern, like disarmament and the climate crisis and ending poverty around the world. Um, so instead of, having a Cold War mentality, we should have a mentality that looks for areas of cooperation. Um, now, I think that doesn't mean we have to be silent about human rights violations anywhere. On the other hand, the U.S. has a hard time being credible on that because we have so many human rights violations in our own country. We have more people incarcerated than any other country on earth per capita, and absolutely, uh, George Floyd, his murder by the cops was broadcast all over the world. Until we address those problems, we're not going to have a lot of credibility when we criticize other countries' violations of human rights. Even if we are correct, we don't have the credibility until we clean up our own act. Amy Swank, have you read any good books that you could recommend? Well, I put a list of 10 that I kind of read over the holidays. Um, I'm reading a couple books right now. One's called Electrify. I don't completely agree with the author, but you're going to have to electrify all sectors of the economy. And he's just sort of gave the general rationale for that, which I already agree with. I'm looking for what he says about particular technologies. So I have to get further into that one. It's another book I just got called A Left Green New Deal. It's from basically written by Die Linke, or the Left Party in Germany. The Rosa Luxemburg Institute is their, foundation, which has a presence in the United States. And again, I'm in the beginning of it. They get the history of the Green New Deal wrong, particularly in the United States. They just start with, AOC and Bernie Sanders, and don't acknowledge the Green Party. It was our signature issue for a decade before it was picked up by those progressive Democrats. But I gather, I haven't got all the way through it, that we're pretty much on the same page. We've got to socialize key sectors of the economy to implement a Green New Deal. And then toward the end of the book, they talk about a connected party, which I think means the electoral party needs to be connected to the social movements. And I got to read what they say about that, but I'm interested in seeing that. I've got about half a dozen books started, but lately, the last couple of weeks, as this Ukraine thing has unfolded, I've spent a lot of time, online reading about Ukraine, and even when I go to bed, reading off my phone or listening to podcasts about it rather than reading books. So that's where my reading is at the last month or so. Wow, it's 4 o'clock already. So I guess I'll reiterate what I said. We've got to oppose Russia's aggressive war against Ukraine. We got to demand that the U.S. And NATO allow and support Ukraine becoming non-aligned, neutral militarily. And then we need to encourage that the parties go back to the Normandy format where they came up with the Minsk Agreement to work on reconciling the Russian and Ukrainian speaking segments of Ukraine and come up with a deal that people can get behind and will lead to a ceasefire and a political system that everybody can participate in. That seems to me to be the top line demands. And I think people should be looking for the statements from the left in Russia and the left in Ukraine, as well as their peace groups. They tend to support what I just raised, but also they have other demands, like the Ukrainian left is calling for Zelensky to nationalize their big corporations, confiscate the wealth of the oligarchs, and put that into social needs as well as military defense. That's not for us to raise, but I think it's important for us to understand what those movements are calling for, because in the end, that's who we're in solidarity with. It's not the Russian state, it's not the US state, it's not even the Ukrainian state. It's with the movements of people and workers fighting for peace and democracy. So, I would urge people to check out those sources as they think about what's going on in Ukraine. And we also got to get out there and, demand peace, and that the U.S. take a different role instead of such an antagonistic role with U.S. NATO expansion. And then go back to, our demands. As I said, it's going to be a difficult period with the war going on. It's very hard for progressive movements to get traction because it all becomes about military. And, are we, putting enough money into the military to defend against further Russian aggression, which I don't think is happening. I don't think Putin's going into the Baltics or going to attack Poland or something like that. But that's, the kind of discussion that's going on right now. So it's going to be very hard to call for decreases in military spending and putting that money into the people's needs and environmental protection and climate protection. But that's what we got to do. And I think, we know from the polls, the majority of people are with us on those issues. So we need to be out there organizing those people and mobilizing them, both in issue campaigns and elections. And even though it's a tough period, in the end, we got to have faith that we're going to be able to organize and mobilize the majority of people and make some real changes. Because we sure know that the Democrats and Republicans are not going to do it. So with that, we'll see you next week, and hope everything goes well, and let's pray for peace.